the News Channel 5 network. This is Open Line.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Open Line. Glad you are with us. It is Tuesday, August 18th, and we are going back in time tonight, 100 years, to a time when the country was bitterly divided. That's something we probably understand a little bit about. And if you went back 100 years, let's say 100 years and a day, these are some of the arguments you would hear. Giving women the right to vote would disturb the harmony of families, promote divorces, multiply the number of old bachelors and old maids. So those are some of the arguments that were swirling around here in Tennessee a little more than 100 years ago, before Tennessee ratified the right to vote for women, and then that made it law all across the country. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We've been talking about it all day on News Channel 5. Such an important role that our state played in this moment. And we're going to talk tonight with Miranda Fraley Rhodes. She is curator of Ratified, the Tennessee Women and the Right to Vote. That's at the Tennessee State Museum. Joining us via Zoom because of course, social separation and all of that. But thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, I'm fascinated. When you go back and read about this, how divided we were, I almost find comfort in it because I see that we're so divided today. And then you go back and you read some of the things that were being said. Allowing women to vote would disturb the harmony of families, promote divorces, multiply the number of old bachelors and old maids. It sounds out there now, but it shows how bitter this battle was, right? This was incredibly divisive and incredibly bitter. Is that right?
That's exactly right. The suffragists faced a lot of opposition. And the anti-suffragists, they tried to convince people that women gaining the right to vote would basically upset the gender norms of the day completely. You see a lot of cartoons with men sometimes dressed in women's clothes being left with the crying baby while the wife goes off to vote. So anti-suffragists used a lot of arguments of that nature.
They were saying things like a woman's place is in the home, suffrage is a fatal mistake. But was there also something else at play here? Was race involved in this somehow, and if so, how?
Yes, race was very much a factor in the suffrage movement, both in the opposition it experienced and among suffragists themselves. So especially in the South, in states where beginning in the 1890s, laws had been passed to really limit the number of people that could vote, especially aimed at disenfranchising African American men. There were fears among anti-suffragists that if the question of women voting was opened, that would also raise challenges to the disenfranchisement measures that had been passed. Among suffragists themselves, many white suffragists did not accept African American suffragists as full partners in the movement. They tended to try to marginalize the participation of African American women, which there are some very prominent African American women with ties to Tennessee that were involved in the movement nationally, like Ida B. Wells Barnett and Mary Church Terrell, as well as local African American women leaders like Gino Frankie Pierce. And there were some efforts to really bridge that gap, especially with Mrs. Pierce and Catherine Kinney here in Nashville. But race was very much a dividing factor within the movement itself.
And how did that resolve itself? So how did they overcome this issue of race? And how close did it come to derailing Tennessee approving women's right to vote?
Mm-hmm. Well, I wouldn't say that it was ever resolved, the issue. One thing that Tennessee suffragists were very sort of open about were really the divisions within their movement. Between 1914 and 1918, there were even 2 state suffrage organizations because of the split. So
Wow.
the suffragists very much acknowledged a range of opinions amongst themselves, and despite those divisions, they triumphed. They didn't let that stop them. They were all working towards the same goal, and even though they didn't always agree, they just kept right on fighting.
So the way this worked, Congress approved the 19th Amendment in June of 1919. By the next summer, 100 years ago, 35 of the nation's 48 states at that time had voted to ratify. 8 states had rejected it. 3 refused to weigh in. So it was down to only 2 states, right? It was down to Tennessee and North Carolina. One of those 2 needed to vote in favor. And as I understand it, people saw Tennessee as a difficult option, right? I mean, this wasn't a natural option. And why is that?
Really, any state in the South was going to be a hard fight, because that was where the strongest opposition to the 19th Amendment really was. It's like most of the states that had voted against it were in the South. So it really came down to sort of what could suffragists do? And Tennessee really became their last best hope. And Tennessee was seen as wanting to be progressive in many ways. They had hosted the National American Woman Suffrage Association Conference in 1914 here in Nashville. And that had brought a lot of positive publicity to the cause of women's suffrage in the state. And suffragists had been working here for many decades in their cause. And thankfully, it all came together here in August 1920.
Yeah, 100 years ago, August of 1920. And so take us back to that time. I believe both sides, those who supported this and those who were opposed, had an area there at the Hermitage Hotel, right? And they were both lobbying the state legislature for their side to prevail. And so take us back to that time and what it would have looked like and how close the vote was, kind of what was going on, let's say 100 years and a day ago, right before they vote to ratify.
Sure. So Nashville became the center of activity for both suffragists and anti-suffragists. They poured into town, and the Hermitage Hotel was very much the place to be for both groups, which meant there were constant opportunities for friction. The anti-suffragists even staged their own anti-suffrage exhibit at the Hermitage Hotel that they invited guests to visit. And it's like you never knew who you were going to encounter in the hall, right, or the elevator. So they were all kind of packed in there together. And it was really a situation where it was just too close to call. The suffragists had been hard at work before the special session, polling legislators on whether or not they would vote to ratify. Some of those records are now at the Tennessee State Library and Archives in the Carrie Chapman Cat collection. People can still see how legislators were saying they would choose to vote on this measure. And it was just a really tense situation because it was not clear if Tennessee was going to ratify. And one of the things that's at stake in this was women's ability to vote in the 1920 presidential election. Both parties had been sort of working with the expectation that women would be able to vote in that election, and then it remained undecided. So this was really a big issue nationally, and the focus came down to Tennessee.
And was there some compromise? I mean, is there a reason it passed? Was there, I don't know, a road promised to be built in somebody's district if they voted for it, or was there some carrot or stick that was out there? Was it just the goodness of their heart that they decided at the last moment to pass this, or kind of what was there any behind the scenes maneuvering that helped get this passed?
Well, one thing that played a critical role was a letter by Feb Burns to her son, Harry T. Burns. So he was from McMinn County, and he was one of the very youngest state legislators. And in McMinn County, there was quite a bit of opposition to ratification. But Harry Burns regarded his mother very highly and had a lot of respect for her views on the world. And shortly before the ratification vote in the House, she wrote a letter to him encouraging him to support ratification. And although he had been considered an anti-suffragist, in the end, he voted yes. And that was really one of the critical votes. And he faced a lot of criticism for that afterwards. He had to defend himself from charges of being bribed and all sorts of things. And his mother stood behind him, right? And he said that the safest advice for a son to follow was that of his mother.
That's great. That's great. And there was even, I'm reading here, in the hopes of tapping down the local suffrage movement, Tennessee did grant women limited voting rights. Is that right? That they said you don't need a federal amendment. We will allow you to vote, but not in all elections. Was that going on, that women could vote, but not in all elections, not in federal elections?
That's exactly right. So in 1919, the Tennessee General Assembly passed a law that allowed Tennessee women to vote in presidential and municipal elections. In order for women to vote in state elections, that would require a change to the state constitution. And basically, it's really hard to change the state constitution. And Tennessee suffragists, they were delighted at this victory because of a clause in the state constitution that forbade legislators who were elected after a federal constitutional amendment was sent to the states from voting on it. They didn't really expect Tennessee to be a factor in the 19th Amendment's ratification. And one of the reasons that the state was able to play such a critical role was the U.S. Supreme Court overturned restrictions like the one in the Tennessee Constitution. So basically in 1919, Tennessee suffragists felt like they had won a great victory. They started transitioning from a suffrage organization to a League of Women Voters organization, because now they were voters, and many women did register to vote and participated in the 1919 municipal elections.
Wow, that's so interesting. And so if we went to the exhibit there at the museum, Ratified, what kind of things would we see?
Sure. Well, lots of artifacts. And also, we very much focused on the personal stories of women. So you'll see a lot of historic images. Our exhibit includes a variety of films. We partnered with Nashville Public Television and have parts from their documentary, By One Vote, are available in the exhibit. And as far as the artifacts, we really want to help visitors understand why Tennessee suffragists thought it was so important for women to obtain the vote. So we go way back to the early 1800s and look at women who were acting politically before they had the vote. We look at reasons why women wanted the vote. What were they experiencing? There's a big focus on the Tennessee suffrage movement. We also have a section on the ratification battle itself, and then a section that really explores what did women do with the vote in the 1920s when more women began to run for elected office. up into the middle of the 1900s with the modern civil rights movement.
So what impact did it have? All right, so 1 year women are not allowed to vote, and then suddenly they are allowed to vote. And people are worried about change. They're always scared about change. And we're scared about change now. And so what can we learn from, I mean, it seems kind of crazy now to think we wouldn't let women vote. But all right, so there was this big fight. People were very concerned about it. You heard some of the things they were arguing that would happen. What did happen? How did it change who was elected potentially, and maybe who ran in the next 10 years? So it was ratified in 1920. Between 1920 and 1930, what impact did women voting have on this country?
It had a very large impact, especially on the status of women. Women really went from being people who petitioned, like, please help us with this, to voters who helped determine who was elected to office. So that was a big shift in women's access to really participating in government. Also, the whole political culture changed. Suddenly, the number of potential voters doubled, right? And politics had been considered very much the realm of men. Polling places, a lot of times, were not situated in places where a lot of women would feel comfortable going, and especially taking their children with them to vote. So you see women asking that polling places be moved to areas like schools, where they were comfortable going with their children. And it's really this change in the political culture to admit women and have it not be kind of an exclusively male space. And as far as the election of 1920, it was such a question because political leaders could not predict how women would vote. And they were seen as being potentially the deciding factor. And just nobody knew what would happen. And it was really interesting when you look back in newspapers from the time and you read statements by candidates running for office in Tennessee who had been opposed to women's suffrage, and then they're trying to appeal to women voters. It's like it very quickly became obligatory, right? Even if you had opposed them voting, now women were voting, so that had to be dealt with. And women were very much interested in voting. Until 1922 in Tennessee, women didn't have to pay poll taxes. Beginning in 1922, the poll tax applied to women, and that did affect women's ability to participate. But they were very much a factor, and you start seeing really a growth in the number of women running for elected office, too. The first woman to serve in the Tennessee Senate was elected in 1921.
Oh, wow. So right after.
So quite early on.
So right after, the first woman elected. Mm-hmm. And what I find interesting is we see throughout history, and we've seen it in the civil rights movement sometimes, that those who have power are reluctant to just relinquish it. And you have a situation here where men are in control. And it's interesting to me that they are willing to allow a whole new group of people to vote, and it's this wild card. They don't know what is going to happen as a result. And it would seem like the easier course would be to say, no, let's just keep things the way they are. And that's why I'm kind of surprised. In a way, it seems crazy that women couldn't vote. But then when you go back to that time, and the idea of major change and the idea of men having power and relinquishing some of that power, that is fairly remarkable. And I guess that goes back to my initial question, what caused them to relinquish that power? It was their moms, or what was it that caused them to say, yeah, let's just let a whole new group of people vote and see what happens?
And I think there were certainly more than one factor involved. If you look back at the sources from the time period, you see even people who oppose votes for women acknowledging that it's pretty inevitable, right? There's a sense that it's coming. Increasing numbers of women in other states in the West, women start to get the vote, and then that begins to spread, especially, say, after 1910. There's the sense that it's coming, and basically, do you want to be refusing to accept the change that's going to happen anyway, or do political leaders want to get on board with the change? It's like by the time Tennessee really became a factor in the ratification of the 19th Amendment, both political parties were putting a lot of pressure on leaders in Tennessee. They wanted the amendment to pass. So I think it really did become inevitable, which was suffragist hope, right? That's one of the reasons the National American Woman Suffrage Association had worked for decades at the state level to try to get enough states that had women voters that they could really build momentum for a federal amendment.
And so do you find comfort, and I know you're a historian, but do you find comfort by looking back at a bitter battle like this and how it turned out? We have the luxury of looking back on things through history, and then you fast forward to today when things are so divided for so many different reasons. Does it give you comfort that we were that divided back then, that maybe we can get through some of the things that divide us now? Are there lessons we can learn from what happened in that debate that can be translated to where we are now?
You know, one thing I find so interesting about studying the history of Tennessee suffragists is really how human they are. And although they are flawed, although they, in some cases, fight with each other, right? They're pretty open about that. They have a lot of divisions amongst them. They didn't let it stop them. You know, they were really determined. They kept going. They kept trying. Even when they had disagreements, they kept trying to move forward and trying to find a way to work together. We see that in, for a while, there was the Tennessee Equal Suffrage Association and the Tennessee Equal Suffrage Association Incorporated, two different state groups. And in 1918, they're able to come back together as the Tennessee Woman Suffrage Association, and they just really push forward. And it's like at that time, you also have Tennessee women like Sue Shelton White, who are working with the National Woman's Party. I mean, she's getting arrested in Washington, D.C. and imprisoned for her protest activities. And not all the suffragists back in Tennessee approve of what she's doing, but they're all really working towards the same goal. And it's exciting to see what they're able to accomplish despite their complexities, which they didn't try to gloss over. They were pretty upfront about their disagreements, but they kept on going.
We have to take a break, but I want to come back. Well, we'll open up the phone lines, too, if you want to call in with questions or comments. Fascinating topic, really. And it's interesting to think that this was a decades-long fight. And we can talk about this, that at one point it was going to be the 16th Amendment, then it was the 17th Amendment, then the 18th, then it was finally the 19th Amendment. So that shows it kept getting delayed and pushed back. And there was a new group of women suffragists who said, we are not going to ask, we are going to demand, we are going to offend people. We don't care about being ladylike. So that's what eventually, I guess, got it done. So we can talk about that. We'll take a break. If you want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. Take a break. Be back right after this.